Well, I think we can go ahead and circle back and take a look at a previous video that I made a while back through some new information that I have added to it that I've happened to find in a little document by Manly Hall that I'm going to show you here in just a minute. It was called The Long Face Whose Face is Always in Profile. It's another name for what we call in Jewish mysticism, we call it the macroprosopis. There's different layers of what's actually occurring here, depending on what area of the human body correspondence that we're talking to, whether it's cosmic or not. So, for example, the very center of the Orion Nebula may be called the Ancient of Days. And but what we see is that the larger area of the Orion Nebula is called something different. The reason I'm showing you this image right here, this is Michelangelo's creation of Adam. And as we know from Rabbi Benjamin Bleck, who has a book on the New York Times bestseller list, that Michelangelo was painting everything in the Sistine Chapel regarding Kabbalah. But he also did this in another painting as well, which is the Conversion of Saul, which I've also shown you before as well. Somehow he tapped into some form of consciousness that allowed him to paint the Orion Nebula in detail that is Hubble quality. And this type of thing has been happening in both the visual spectrum and the infrared spectrum all the way back into ancient times. And that's the reason why we see the winged disk repeated over and over again, but we can only see it in infrared. That's the reason why we see infrared depictions of the Orion Nebula in churches such as Karlskirche. But the point of this is to show you what we're looking at here. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at a brain, which is what he painted, but he's also painted it to where it is a face facing in right profile. And this, in the Book of Concealed Mystery that we read in Jewish mysticism, this is actually describing something called the Ancient of Days. And this is what he's actually painted. So what I've got to do here is I'm going to show you, I'm going to play a couple of Manly Hall clips for you. That's kind of going to refresh your memory on the information that was in the previous video. But as I go through these, I want you to listen to the definitions of what Manly Hall is talking about when he describes this particular force or being, which is really a larger macrocosmic version of man. And you're going to see that as he goes through and describes the various parts of this thing, that they will come out matching what we see here in this painting, because Michelangelo painted a brain. He painted it in right profile. He didn't paint it to where it's facing straight towards you. All of this is for a reason. This is the symbolism that we actually see and is actually being told to us with Jewish mysticism. So, and just to show you, when we take a look at the Orion Nebula, we see that it is a brain facing in right profile. We know this because when we go up this close to the painting, we know that he painted the Orion Nebula. So it's just a matter of math, putting it all together. Now we know that it's a brain facing in right profile. So with that, let's listen to what Manly Hall has to say about the description of what we're actually looking at here and what Michelangelo showed us in his painting.
The Jewish mysticism, the development of the great concept, resulted also in a secondary God form. This secondary God form was called macroprosopis, or the long face. The macroprosopis represented the revelation of deity in the creation process. And there emerged out of the mystery of infinite being the gigantic figure, like the giant of the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, a mysterious and colossal figure with one foot upon the oceans and the other upon the land.
So this being appeared out of the infinite. This is the same thing that was described in the previous video I showed you, where we were talking about Osiris Ta, the potter, right? Creating the architect, creating things from it. And this right here is being described the same thing. Now listen to what he says.
around whose body the stars and planets moved.
The Orion Nebula creates stars, and around inside of it, the stars and planets move, but also outside of it as well, because it controls the stars outside of it, and everything that is contained within the whole body of this area. You might consider this the brain, and the rest of the stars outside of the brain are still part of the body of the brain, so this brain still controls those stars that are outside of it. Just like when you hear in the Bible, for example, can you loosen the bands of Orion, or can you the sweet influences of Pleiades, can you bind the sweet influences? So all of these things are showing that it has control over these stars.
And whose face was always in profile.
And then he mentions that the face is always in profile. And that's exactly what Michelangelo showed us, and that's exactly what we see here. So we see a description of this being coming out of the infinite, whose face is always in profile, that the stars and planets move around. You see what I'm getting at? This is exactly what we're looking at when we take a look at the Orion Nebula, and whose face is always in profile. And by the pattern matching that Michelangelo showed us, we can clearly see that this is what is being discussed.
This one-eyed god has been called the sun god, and many ancient people insist that the sun deity is always properly represented with one eye. In the Kabbalah of the Hebrews, the God of Israel, which neither slumbers nor sleeps, is always presented symbolically in profile, so that only one eye is visible.
And when we take a look at what he's referring to inside the Book of Concealed Mystery, it's also called the Eye of Providence. And what is the symbol for the Eye of Providence? Well, it's the eye inside the triangle. And that is the one eye that he's speaking of. And that's the reason why this thing is in profile. You can actually see the pineal gland sitting right in the middle, which is that triangle. And inside the triangle on the human body actually represents this area that you see right here that's dark. And right in the very center of that I've shown you before is this vortex that looks just like a pineal gland. And it sits right where the pineal gland is. And so this is what he's referring to. This is the sun god he's actually referring to.
Because deity was represented always with one eye. This mysterious Macroprosophus, or the long face, was the clothed god. No longer clothed as an old gentleman, but clothed in creation. God as creation.
Now what he's actually referring to there is that when the infinite, which is invisible, which you can't see, it's a spiritual type thing, when it projects itself into physical reality, it's actually projecting an extension of itself. And this is why the first thing that comes out of the infinite is actually a pattern or an archetype that represents, in probably more than one way, the infinite. So it represents mind, the supreme mind, but it represents it in a more, it's in a less infinite form, but it's still a projection of itself. And that's what he's referring to, is because from the spiritual and invisible, we can't see, it projects itself into physical reality. And so at this point, it is now considered a clothed God, but it still has the archetype that represents what is actually projected it. Okay, so it's kind of a mirror of itself, but in physical reality. Now, this is the part I wanted to show you tonight, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of this document, and you're going to see how this is kind of all coming together as far as the identification, this specific identification that you see out here. You see, when you hear all these things normally, you go, oh wow, what a cool, neat story that is, and it doesn't sound like anything that would be real. But when you start doing the digging into the symbolism, you realize this is the way the universe is actually set up. It's set up just like man is, but at a larger level. So things are described in such a way that they sound almost fairy tale-ish, but they're not. It's actually a real deal. So this is the next part I wanted to play for you.
The vestments of this being were like the radiant fringe of the Milky Way, and it was surrounded by angels full of eyes, which were the stars.
Okay, so it's surrounded by angels full of eyes, which are the stars. This is describing a nebula, again.
And its vehicle was the Mercavah of Ezekiel, the chariot of righteousness.
And that's the part that I want to show you here in just a second. So remember Ezekiel's vision in the Bible, right? So what he's calling this thing is the chariot of righteousness.
And in the midst of this great machinery of the universe sat the Ancient of the Most Ancients, the power at the root of all things, unchangeable and in its own visage unknowable.
So in the very middle of this thing he's describing sits the Ancient of the Ancient Ones, right here. And this represents physically what we see as the pineal gland, but it really represents consciousness in a more of a allegorical, spiritual sense. See, everything that we see in physical reality is kind of symbolic, because everything in reality is all mental. So in order to make sense of anything for us at this point in this reality, we have to see things and symbolism and things like, because everything that we actually see when you take a look at nature, and even in R.A. Schwaller de Lubeck's Egypt's Science and the Evolution of Consciousness, he describes that over his studies that the ancient Egyptians, they used to look at all of nature, and by looking at nature, nature provided them symbolic code, symbolic messages that gave them information about the physical, mental, and spiritual planes of existence. And they were able to use that in order to come up with some of the most incredible understandings of the universe that we've ever seen. This is one of the things that the pyramid was actually showing us. This is the reason why the pyramid has so much built into it as far as math and things like that. They were trying to show us knowledge, but in a very holistic sense. They were also showing us that the pyramid was related to man, because man is the measure of all things. And the ancients understood that if you understand man, that you can understand all kinds of things about the cosmos, the universe, just all of the incredible mathematical computations that they put together, all inside the Great Pyramid. Now, I'm glad I printed this off the website, because the website now is down, and the archive, or the web archive, does not have anything logged on it at all. So if I hadn't printed this out, and I'm sure it's probably available somewhere else on the internet, but there are also a lot of interesting links on there. So let this be a reminder, if you find good information on there on the internet, make sure to always print it to PDF, because you never know when it's going to go away. So this is called Healing the Divine Art, Pineal Gland. And I'll read a little bit of this to you here. And I don't know why it printed it so largely. But this is Manly Hall up here, Healing the Divine Art by Manly Hall. Organ of spiritual sight. Medical gland specialists are in general agreement that the true purpose of the pineal gland in the life of the human being is unknown, and they doubt whether the pineal gland is active in the normal adult. These conclusions are not in agreement with the results of clairvoyant investigations, which indicate that the pineal gland is active throughout life and is the positive organ of spiritual sight within the body. So you might say that if you can see things that most people cannot see, perhaps you have activated your pineal gland, as long as they make sense. There's a difference between drinking too much and seeing pink elephants flying across the room, and seeing data in the universe that actually makes sense. But I believe, and I have a hunch, that by practicing burning symbolism and things like this into your head, that you can actually improve this thing. But it takes a certain way of thinking. You have to be open to it. It's just my guess. I have no idea. What do I know? So this is an interesting diagram that he shows right here. And what does it look like? Well, it looks like there's something orbiting this thing in his head. The pineal gland, a global haze of blue-green luminosity, marks the gland's magnetic field. The axis of the field is inclined, and the whole resembles a miniature solar system. The mental field of the pineal gland form resembles a spherical glass bottle and seems to rest on the surface of semi-liquid mist. Interesting, huh? That's kind of what we see when we take a look at the Orion Nebula. And we see that the Orion Nebula would be the central sun. The central sun meaning the so-called black hole of our immediate black hole, the one that applies to us. So it goes on, and this diagram is very interesting, and we'll come back to that in just a second because I want to show you what I believe that this is supposed to be linked up to. So let's take a look at this. Okay, so this is the part, and this comes from Blavatsky that he quotes inside this document, but it says the 7 principal organs of the brain itself are physical extensions of these glandular vortices. All physical organs are physical extensions of the invisible energy centers throughout the physical body. The brain is the Merkava or Chariot. Okay, now let's play something again for the...
The vestments of this being were like the radiant fringe of the Milky Way, and it was surrounded by angels full of eyes, which were the stars. And its vehicle was the Mercavah of Ezekiel, the chariot of righteousness. And in the
So the brain is the Merkavah of Ezekiel and the chariot of righteousness. The brain is the Merkavah or chariot, Sanskrit Vahan, of the pineal gland, and the 10 smaller vortices in the aura of the gland are the horses attached to the chariot of the sun, the racing steeds described by Saint Chrysostom. So here we have now a specific designation that this area, whose face is always in profile, the stars and planets move around it. It's called a Merkava, which is the chariot of righteousness and is the brain. Well, it just doesn't get any more clear than this. What Michelangelo actually painted, he painted the Orion Nebula. We know this from pattern matching. So this particular area is exactly what is being described, and is the pineal gland. It is our central invisible sun. Now, the last thing I wanted to show you here was regarding the diagram that we saw inside his document. This is not complete yet, but I wanted to kind of give you a foreshadow of what might be he might have been discussing. Because we know that the pyramid represents the head, and we know that the king's chamber has something to do with the pineal gland. So when we take his image and we put it inside here, I believe that somehow it's supposed to fit in here. What I did find out is this, and let me just go ahead and knock it down a little bit here. Okay, these air shafts, this air shaft coming from the king's chamber is actually at 45 degrees. Now, the angle, if we knock the pyramid down here, let's see, knock this thing up. I guess we'll have to knock this pyramid up just a little bit more here. Okay, so the angle between this crosshair that you see on the person, okay, and this orbiting object, if we take a look at the angle between this horizontal one, or this one that's kind of at an incline, and this orbiting object, it's at 45 degrees, so it's at the same angle that we have on a flat plane to what's coming off the king's chamber here. So I believe that we're dealing with something here, and I believe that this other angle right here, this has something to do with the an imitation of Earth versus the Orion Nebula, because the Orion Nebula is the pineal gland, and this right here is what they call an antibody that orbits it. Well, the Earth might be considered an antibody of the Orion Nebula. I know this is kind of deep right now, but remember, the Earth is a mirror of the Orion Nebula. So when we look up to the Orion Nebula, we're kind of looking at a mirror or an opposite of ourselves. And so this orbit that we see right here and the angles, part of this may be involved with the tilt of the Earth. But I do believe that this is what Manly Hall is trying to show. And I think it's kind of interesting too, because you can see that the way he designed this thing, it's not really exactly natural for the way that this human's neck and his head is in here. Someone's neck usually doesn't come out at an angle. Like it's kind of an unnatural looking position. He's kind of like got his head stuck out too far. But I think he did it this way. If he's the one that designed this, and I think he is, he designed it so that it could be placed in here some way, the way that it's supposed to be. So there's a little foreshadow. And so what he was actually showing us is that the pineal gland is kind of in the middle of what is mentally a mini solar system inside this area, and it is the center. It is the center, or the central sun, the central invisible sun. And I just thought you might be interested in seeing all the definitions applied to this particular area, including the Chariot of Righteousness, which is actually the brain, and this is the same thing as the vision of Ezekiel. So you guys take care, and I'm going to work on this and see if I can't figure this thing out, the angles of it and so forth. I may be, going the wrong direction with this. We'll have to see, but it appears to me that this is what he's trying to convey here. So you guys have a good night. I'll talk to you soon.